Hello everyone and welcome to HJW Gaming and a continuation of my Commander Guide series. This episode will be looking at Aragorn, King of Men. Aragorn, King of Men is a tier 3 commander who I think rather unfairly doesn't see a particularly large amount of use. And I think a large amount of this comes down to the fact that you get the tier 2 Aragorn so cheaply in your first season if you pick the good side, with him coming out in the $1 deal that you can pick up the commander invite for. So a lot of people tend to go with Aragorn 2 and pump him up to high respect before they maybe get lucky enough to unlock the invitation for Aragorn, King of Men. So therefore he doesn't see a huge amount of use. And I think this is potentially a little bit unfair, as if you look at his skill set, he actually has a pretty magnificent set of kit with a lot of high damage dealing skills, strong damage mitigation, resistance to stuns and madness, which are very prevalent in the meta, and also a pretty strong healing set, which can make him good early game for PvE as well. So now we're going to take a deep dive into his best equipment, troop loadouts, and also some battle reports, and which matchups you should aim for. I really hope you enjoy. So first up, let's look at the general overview of Aragorn, King of Men. He gains respect through the Royal Banner of Elendil item. His role is that of a leader, which means that at level 20 he unlocks plus 5 commander command, so he can have an additional up to 500 troops. He's said to lead man units best in combat, and also has some healing skills in his arsenal. If you look at his generic stats, he actually has a fairly balanced skill set, though he's primarily weighted towards might, which is very useful as a lot of his skills do deal physical damage. His unique item is Anduril, which grants bonus might, up to 6 bonus HP for his mannish units, and comes with the bonus of Kingly Inspiration, which makes all of your men units, upon dealing damage, have a 50% chance of damage dealt plus 1%. Now this can stack up to 20 times, and of course once 5 times refined, that can be plus 6%. So once stacked 20 times, plus 120% damage. Now, in my opinion, this is a fairly mediocre item, particularly when you look at the other tier 3 respect items, such as Gandalf the Whites or Isildur's. The reason for this being in that the main buff actually boosts the damage of mannish units, and not Aragorn, King of Men himself, which is disappointing as his best build is designed around increasing his commander damage and not his unit damage. He tends to use very low damage units, so actually increasing their damage doesn't do a huge amount. Though that said, the bonus 6 HP can come very much in handy. Though in my opinion, there's better flawless gear that you could spend your hard-earned resources on. Speaking of gear, let's take a look at the Exquisite Gear that I recommend using on Aragorn, King of Men. Now you've got a couple of choices in most areas here. First up, weapon-wise, I'd recommend first off using a weapon that has the buff Pierce. The reason for this is the Pierce buff grants your commander a 50% chance of his normal attacks dealing an additional 160% physical damage when these weapons are fully refined. Now this is just another feather to his bow and adds another huge amount of commander damage. In my testing, this did come out superior to my other recommended Exquisite Gear, which is a battle axe with flay, which allows your commander to strike through 30% of the opponent's defense when fully refined. Overall, I found a Pierce to be more consistent and have a higher damage output. The difference between the dirk and the bow is the dirk grants additional speed, however the bow has more might, so that's the one I'd recommend, as the might will increase your commander's physical damage the most. Chest-wise, I'd primarily recommend the 2 staple chest units, which are the Superior Hauberk with fire protection against evil, and the Quilted Armour with focus protection up against good side. The reason for this is we want to mitigate elemental damage as much as possible, as elemental damage ignores the defense stat, so if you're using a monostack of very high defense units, elemental damage will just cut straight through all of that. So therefore, I think it's best to mitigate against the most common forms of elemental damage for both good and evil side, with good side pretty much only having access to focus damage, and evil side using fire damage very commonly due to alchemists and prevalence of the Witch King. Another option if you're facing good side could be to use a superior hauberk with melee vigour if you're not seeing a lot of focus damage commanders such as Gandalf the White or Galadriel, or a low use of the Keeper units. The reason for this is it provides a large amount of might, a high amount of defense for your tank units, and if you don't need the elemental resistance, you get up to plus 6% less damage received by your melee units. So this can be a strong damage resistance if you're coming up against a lot of physical damage. Helm-wise, my main recommendation would be the Brutal Helmet with Melee Vigour. Again, Melee Vigour offers that up to 6% damage reduction for your melee units, and the Brutal Helmet itself offers plus 3 HP as well as a strong amount of might for increasing your unit's survivability and also Aragorn King of Men's commander damage. Another option you could use if you're coming up against evil side is to use a full helm with Blinding Barrier. Blinding Barrier provides up to 60% elemental damage resistance for the Tier 2 Knight unit. This can be very strong when used as a mono stack on damage commanders when coming up against evil side. As I said earlier, they tend to use a lot of elemental damage such as focus from Sauron and particularly fire damage from the alchemists. So if you can negate this by 60% purely through the Blinding Barrier helm, and even combine that, say, with the fire protection hauberk, that 120% fire reduction is going to massively curb the damage you receive from a Witch King and make him very effective against evil side. So against evil, a full helm with Blinding Barrier is also a very viable option, though a Brutal Helmet isn't a bad option either. As for an accessory, I'd only recommend one, and that is the Hithlane with Mend. The Hithlane is mainly recommended as, again, it provides that plus 3 HP, which is great for unit survivability, and it's also the only exquisite accessory to provide bonus might, so this is definitely the one to choose, and Mend gives us just a little bit of extra healing to keep our units alive. So as you can see, this gear has primarily been selected to maximise the commander damage coming from Aragorn Elessar. But also, we need to improve his troop survivability, as you'll see from his skills later on, the majority of his damage does not come in until round 6. As commander damage scales with the amount of command you have available left in your army at the time of hit, we need to keep as many troops alive as possible, so when that huge amount of damage comes in round 6, we can deal as much damage as possible. And that's a trend we're going to follow on when we look here at Flawless Gear. So for Flawless Weaponry, I'm looking at the Axe of Khazad-dûm with Cleave, which is definitely an advancement upon his unique item. The reason for this is that the Axe of Khazad-dûm provides nothing but an enormous amount of might for Aragorn Elessar, which will massively increase that damage from all of his skills. And with the Cleave buff, you get another opportunity, like Pierce, to deal commander damage. However, this has a 50% chance of dealing up to 240% physical damage, though of course it's harder to refine than the Exquisite variant. I have a couple of different recommendations for chestplate wise, but the main one I would recommend is the Plate of the Citadel with Tactical Retreat. The reason for this is what this does is after round 6, which is exactly the same time that Aragorn King of Men's primary damage kicks in, you gain up to plus 30% damage resistance for all of your units, just a flat damage received buff of 30%. So when his main damage kicks in, you will lose a significant amount less troops, which means for those remaining 4 rounds of battle, Aragorn will continue to put out huge amounts of damage. The fact that you're taking such a massive amount less damage for those final 4 rounds as well means that Aragorn King of Men's damage output will be so consistent in those last 4 rounds. However, it's very important that you keep those troops alive up until that point. To help with this, we have 2 different helms. The first is the Cask of Pride, and the second is the Swan Helm. And you'll want to choose which one of these you use depending on which opponents you're coming up against often. For example, the Cask of Pride with melee suppression is very good, as it can reduce the damage from enemy melee units by up to 30% when fully refined. Whereas the Swan Helm with arrow suppression does 30% as well, but up against enemy ranged units. Primarily, I think the Swan Helm's probably better if you're facing against good side, as when you come up against popular meta commanders, such as Gil-galad, you'll find that the majority of good side damage output comes from their ranged units. So being able to reduce that by 30% will massively improve the survivability of your units. Another option for Helmwise, and is potentially slightly rogue, is to just double down on that damage in the last 6 rounds. And that's to use the Cask of the Submerged Isle with the Last Resort option. Now, Determination is obviously a good option as well, as you can give your commander up to 90% madness immunity to prevent him dealing damage to his own troops. But I quite like Last Resort, as that means after round 6, your commander deals up to 30% more damage. Now, as we said earlier, all his skills buff his damage after round 6, and you can also combine that with other gear which reduces your troop damage received by 30%. So if you can also then increase your damage dealt by 30%, in those last 6 rounds, you'll be absolutely annihilating the opponent's units. And last but not least, if we look at accessories, the only real one I can recommend is the Ent Draft Calabash with Gift of Nature. The reason for this is it provides, when fully strengthened, up to +6 to your unit's HP, which again improves their survivability massively. And also it provides bonus might to increase the damage from Aragorn King of Men. And last but not least, Gift of Nature increases his might again, as well as his focus and speed. So it just makes him have much more damage, and also sometimes could outspeed his opponents as well, which can be quite important. Overall, I think the Flawless Gear is a very strong improvement on the Exquisite Gear that you can put on Aragorn King of Men, particularly if you have a very high respect Aragorn King of Men, so you can afford to put skill points into the Strider skill. The Strider skill increases the stat effectiveness of all of the gear you have on Aragorn King of Men. So if you get very highly strengthened Flawless Gear, you can get him to reach extraordinary amounts of might, and therefore deal enormous commander damage. One thing to note is that when facing evil, I would recommend changing over whatever chest plate you have over to the Exquisite variant with fire protection, just again because of that prevalence of the Witch King and the amount of damage that burn can do against your units. So I'd recommend making that switch whenever facing against evil. Now let's take a look at troops, and which troops synergize well with Aragorn King of Men. First up, we have Guard of the Tower. These will be used as your primary tank melee unit because of their high HP and defense, as well as having some very useful damage mitigation buffs. The primary job for these is for as many units to stay alive for as long as possible, as I said earlier, so that we can deal as much damage as possible in the later rounds. The reason I like the Guard of the Tower most as your tank unit is that they're very cheap and you can conscript them very, very quickly. If resource cost or time to conscript doesn't matter, however, I would then recommend using the Cataphract as your primary tank unit. The role of this would be exactly the same as the Guard of the Tower, except that these are even bulkier and have additional damage mitigation, as well as having higher speed. However, as I said, these units are very expensive and can take a long time to conscript, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend using them if you're in the very heat of battle. Though of course you could use them and have them and the Guard of the Tower's conscription queues both running at the same time if you're maining Aragorn King of Men. Another synergy is actually with the Knight unit, which is the tier 2 version of the Cataphract. As I said earlier, these can be used with the Blinding Barrier Helm up against evil to mitigate that elemental damage, so they have very good synergy with damage mitigation against evil side. Another troop that we will look to use in almost all of our builds will be both the Sentinel and the Marksman. Now these aren't used for their damage output, we'll just be using a single command of these a lot of the time due to their damage avoidance skill. What this means is you can prevent damage hitting your main tank unit up to 4 times, as if damage is dealt to the Sentinels the first time, they will avoid it if the opponent doesn't have pursuit, and then on the second time they hit the Sentinel, you'll only lose that one command of 100 units. Similar with the Marksman, so if you have one command of each of a Sentinel and a Marksman, that's 4 hits you can prevent from hitting your main tank unit. And if you think that one of these hits could be, for example, an all-in hit from Dwalin, that's an enormous amount of damage you've prevented from hitting your main tank unit. Now, a couple of other synergies. We have the Swan Knight, which is the Gondor tier 4 unit. This is an alternative to the Cataphract, but it's even bulkier, and with the Protector skill boosting your defense in the first 3 rounds, it particularly synergizes well, as those first 3 rounds you won't take much damage, so you can help them survive to keep your units alive until round 6. And lastly, we have the Dunedain, which is the last available Tier 3 men unit. It can be useful to combat meta good side commanders that rely on ranged units for damage output, as said earlier, such as Elrond or Gil-galad. Now if we flick into the build is the same this time whether you're facing good or evil, though you may choose to use different troop compositions. So first up, we have Anduril. With 15 points allocated to this, you can deal to 2 enemy targets up to 300% physical damage every third round, and it also boosts Aragorn King of Men's might by an additional 15. So this means that every third round you can deal up to 600% damage, which is huge, and also the bonus might obviously helps to increase that damage even further. We're also going to maximise both the sub-skills of Anduril, which are Cull the Weak, which activates every second round and targets the enemy unit with the lowest defense to hit up to 210% damage. Now this can be very useful as usually your enemy unit with the lowest defense will be their highest damage unit. So against evil, this could be potentially an alchemist or a reaper unit, and against good side, this could be, say, a sentinel, which will be their primary damage dealer. And the other sub-skill is Weapons Expertise, which gives your commander a 50% chance of gaining damage plus 60%. Now if you think this combined with some of his very high damage skills, this gives Aragorn, King of Men, the potential for an enormous damage burst. The next essential part of his kit is his Respect 5 skill, which is King of Men. When maximised, King of Men makes your men units receive 90% less damage when they've been affected by stun or madness at any point in the battle. So if you think about facing off, for example, against a Gandalf the Grey, that will inflict a stun in the first round through the wizard skill on the usual PvP good side build. And what that will mean is then for the rest of the battle, you will take 90% reduced damage, so suddenly the opposing troops can deal almost nothing to you. This skill alone makes Aragorn King of Men a fantastic anti-meta commander, as so many pieces of gear, such as the Bone Mask, and so many commanders' skills are geared towards getting stuns and madness for crowd control. So when Aragorn King of Men faces off against these, his troops suddenly get an enormous amount of damage mitigation. We're also going to look to buff his top sub-skill of this, which is Return of the King, and this is what I mentioned earlier with why Aragorn King of Men deals so much damage from the 6th round onwards. So what this skill does is it allows Aragorn to deal up to 70% more damage after the round specified here, so during and after round 5. But the majority of Aragorn King of Men skills, such as Anduril and also Cull the Weak, will activate in round 6, so that'll be where you really start to see his massive damage output come to the fore. Any spare skill points I would recommend allocating to Strider, which increases the base stats received from his equipment by 2% and is the skill I mentioned earlier. And also I'd recommend putting it into Precise Blow and Raid as well, and just equally distributing any remaining points between those 3 skills. Now Precise Blow is a skill that activates every second round and per skill point deals 40% physical damage to one enemy target with the pursuit effect, and Raid activates every third round, and it's a rush skill, meaning it activates in the first round as well, and this deals 34.2% physical damage against one enemy target with a 50% chance of dealing an additional 34.2% damage. Of course, that damage increases by another 34.2% for every skill point that you allocate. So the more skill points that you can give to your Aragorn King of Men, up to Respect 25, his damage just goes up and up and up as you can put more and more points into Precise Blow and Raid, and you're also getting the bonus stats from your equipment as more and more points go into Strider, which is why Aragorn King of Men works so well when he hits really high respect, as he reaches enormous amounts of might and also gets so much extra bonus from the additional damage skills. Now the skill order in which you put the points in is not relevant for activation, so don't worry when you're setting them up, you can just put the skill points in, as and where you like. Now it's worth still mentioning, however, his bottom Respect 0 skill tree, Elessar. Even though this isn't recommended as part of my main PvP build, it's worth mentioning that both Elessar, the title skill, and Elven Blessing provide very good heals, so these skills can make him very, very strong as a starting commander, because these heals can help keep your troops alive and make him very strong in PvE, as well as exorbitance, increasing your unit's damage. So I can very much recommend him as a PvE commander as well. So troop-wise, I have a couple of different recommendations. The first is the standard tank commander build, which is to just run a almost full mono stack, so 7,800 of Guards of the Tower, with then 100 Sentinels and 100 Marksmen, so one command of each. This is, as I said earlier, just so we can get those 4 instances of damage avoidance from the 2 archer units, and then just a massive stack of your tank units to try and keep them alive as long as possible until that round 6 damage burst comes in. However, I have had some very good experiences using a mixed build on this commander. And for this, I do like to use up to 2600 Dunedain, particularly when facing against good side, or when you're facing off against a very high volume of Sanins. The reason for this is the Dunedains soak up that range damage and also deal bonus damage to opposing ranged units, so they can be very anti-meta. So I definitely recommend giving this a shot, though if you're not facing off against much ranged, just go with that mono stack, or additionally a mix of Guards of the Tower and Cataphracts with just one of those avoidance units. The other thing to consider, of course, is just a mono stack of the tier 2 knights, and that's if you're facing evil using the Blinding Barrier Helm, as I mentioned earlier. So let's just quickly discuss which matchups are good for this build of King of Men, and which you should try to avoid. One good matchup is commanders that deal very early stuns or madness to your troops. For example, Gandalf the Grey, Gorbag, Sauron, and Isildur. This triggers the R5 skill nice and early, so it means for the entire duration of your battle, your troops take 90% reduced damage, so you can have that massive damage mitigation and then inflict enormous damage from round 6 onwards. That R5 skill, King of Men, is your primary damage mitigation with King of Men, so you want to be making sure you're always facing off against commanders that deal these early round stuns. Without that activation, you have very negligible damage resistance. Another good matchup is stall commanders, particularly such as Mouth of Sauron. The stalling and just slow amounts of damage they deal will allow King of Men to reach round 6 relatively unscathed, where Return of the King will then kick in and give him a very large damage boost. So if the opponent's commander is primarily focused around healing and stalling, you therefore will likely and absolutely annihilate them. Now, matchups to avoid. Primarily you're looking to avoid any commanders that can deal an enormous amount of early round burst damage. So these are commanders with the Convener skill. In particular, the Witch King is a very troublesome matchup, as unless you're using the Fire Protection Chest and hopefully the Blinding Barrier Helm as well, Convener on Alchemists with the burn damage, the elemental damage going through your unit's high defense will absolutely smite your troops. So try and avoid this unless you're specifically geared against it, which is why I recommend it earlier on. Other Convener commanders, such as Elrond, which deal huge amounts of early round damage without affecting a stun or madness, are also very bad, so Elrond can be one of his worst matchups. Another matchup to avoid are commanders that don't deal any kind of stun or madness, as I said earlier, such as Dwalin. Dwalin deals an enormous amount of commander damage and does not rely on stuns or madness for his damage mitigation, so therefore you don't get that minus 90% damage received, so your troops will likely die pretty quickly without any other damage mitigation. And last but not least, one of the worst things you can have to hit your Aragorn King of Men is Commander Madness. So for example, a Grima. Madness on your troops will make them take 90% less damage, however Madness on your commander can be fatal, as you'll inflict enormous amounts of damage onto your own units, particularly after round 6. Now let's take a look at some battle reports. I do have a couple here. You'll see him facing off against various commanders. As I said earlier, Isildur in particular, he can be very, very strong against, as those early rounds of stun and madness just provide an enormous amount of damage resistance. Similarly, Witch Kings, when you're geared against them appropriately, Nazgul Screech will activate a stun, so therefore you get that damage resistance, and then if you have the fire protection, you will just absolutely chop through them. Similarly with Sauron, even if you don't have focus protection, that early attempt at madness will give you that minus 90% damage resistance as early as possible. So, for a final overview of Aragorn, King of Men. His strengths lie in his very high commander damage, his resistance to stun and madness, the fact that he has very beneficial skills all the way up to respect level 25, and the fact that he's useful in both PvE and PvP. However, his weaknesses are limited effectiveness until he gets to very high respect, where you can really utilise that additional damage coming from the Strider skill tree. He's also vulnerable to Commander Madness, weak to elemental damage, and high early round damage. But overall, I think he's one of the most underrated Tier 3 commanders currently available, and that's likely due to, as I said earlier, his limited effectiveness until he gets to that high respect level. But if you're willing to invest into him and get him to those very high respect levels, he does become potentially one of the best good side commanders on the game, capable of outputting enormous amounts of commander physical damage. With a skill toolbox that grants enormous damage mitigation, resistance from stun and madness, huge commander damage, and even a bonus heal as well, I don't see what else you could need to prove to you that you should be boosting Aragorn King of Men as high as possible. And with that, that's everything I have to offer. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, smash the like button down below, and if this is your first time visiting my channel, please consider hitting the subscribe button, as it does make a massive difference to me. And if you do choose to do any of those things, I really hope to see you on the next one.